But this one is really important. We're going to go back down south to have a conversation about the connectivity with respect to finance. And I think given the conversation that we just heard, given some of the hurdles that are in front of us, we keep coming back to this question of estimating this financial gap. And so Alonso Martinez is here with the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, and also the Biodiversity Finance Initiative, which is called BIOFIN, where he currently acts as a national coordinator. And he began his career at CONAMP, at the Mexico Protected Areas Agency coordinator, contributing to estimating the financial gap of protected areas and developing economic valuation of ecosystem services. So Alonso, the stage is yours.
Muchas gracias, Luis. And well, thanks so much to the Salazar Center and CSU for hosting this amazing event. Thanks for the invitation. Okay, so it's the green one. Yeah, just don't push the red button. Great. Well, thanks so much. The objective of this presentation is not really about BIOFIN, although we are involved in some of the solutions that will be mentioned here, but to give a brief overview and presentation around what is happening in Mexico related to conservation finance. So just a couple messages before. So this was mentioned by Tanya and Citlali yesterday, but when talking about conservation finance in Mexico, we are talking about social finance and social returns of investment always. We work with communities, we depend on communities, we find solutions with communities to create conservation finance mechanisms. So that's something that we always have to have in mind when working in Mexico. So just to get that from start. So yeah, conservation finance is social. 53% of Mexico is social property. That percentage can go up to 70, 80, 90% in biodiversity hotspots. So for those that you don't know that, but protected areas in Mexico are partially or totally owned by communities. So we need to find these solutions along with them. Also, IPLCs, indigenous peoples and local communities, and well, that's a CBD term, and that's how we kind of got started in BIOFIN, so I'm gonna use that term, IPLCs, are crucial for conservation efforts. And with that being said, okay, first of all, which is our current panorama related to expenditure? I know that's not, so, well, this is a methodology we created along with the National Statistic Agency to review the expenditure that was going to biodiversity by the federal government. So I'm sorry I didn't convert this, but just divide it by 18 and you will get it in US dollars. So yeah, any of this by 18. So right now, the expenditure related to biodiversity is around $2 billion, federal public expenditure. And this goes not only, this is not a public budget for protected areas or the ministry. This is the budget that the Secretary of Defense is investing. The Secretary of Agriculture is investing in biodiversity. Is everything in the public account that is going to biodiversity. That's what we did with the Statistic Agency. And we created an expenditure taxonomy just to know, okay, which percentages of each secretary is going all the way to biodiversity. So, well, Mexico had a rising trend all the way to 2016. After that, we saw a decrement that is going still all the way to 2020. And right now, well, we're looking at a big pushback. Of course, these are the pandemic years. And what we want to do with this information is just not creating awareness of the kind of the whole situation, problem, etc., but just also to understand between or which secretaries in which ministries can make a bit more of an effort to start investing in biodiversity. So with that being said, that's our framework, and that's what we're working with. Oh, and sorry, just to let you know, we also expanded this methodology to private sector and also to subnational governments. So we have also some of this information related to private investments in biodiversity, green employment, and etc. And well, also something that was asked is that how we do relate to the Convention of Biological Diversity. I know, well, we all know that the US is not a signatory, but I want to stress that in Mexico, we do take lessons learned from this convention. We translate the convention into national goals, and that kind of gives us our northern start to where we want to go, right? So, well, there are 22 targets right now from last year in Montreal, Kunming, Montreal Biodiversity Framework, and I just included here those that are related to finance. So we have a goal of substantially increase domestic and international funds from every source, so private, finance sector, domestic, philanthropy, everything. We also have a target for reforming subsidies, and this is related to what Peter said yesterday in his amazing presentation about the film. We need to start understanding how subsidies are affecting negatively and also positively biodiversity, and we need to start making reforms for these subsidies, right? So just as an example, in Mexico, fertilizers are just given away by the government, mainly, it's a subsidy, and they are not really controlled into how are they used, the amounts, quantity, quality, etc. And people are just, like using fertilizing without that much capacity development. So that kind of actions we want to look into and try to lower the impact of subsidies. Otherwise, the financial gap will never get to a minimum, or manageable target. So as long as we don't stop negative investments in biodiversity, there's nothing we can do to, counter the positive ones. So also target 14, this is something that was kind of the Mexican apportation, or how do you call it, Mexican promoting in COP 13. And we need and we want that biodiversity is mainstream into intersectoral policies. Otherwise, the same thing. If biodiversity is not something that the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Agriculture has into their strategies, then it will be impossible to close that gap. Well, target 15, I'm gonna speak about that in a bit more. And target 10, sustainable food systems, that also has a relation to how we can convert our current food systems into more sustainable ones. And target 3, which is 30 by 30. And just a quick comment related to target 3 and what I was speaking about at the beginning. Target 3 in Mexico will not look like a mosaic of protected areas and wilderness and everything. Target 30 by 30 in Mexico will look like a mix of archaeological sites, game reserves, protected areas, no-take fishing zones, because we do not have any more land to create massive protected areas, right? So that relates to the finance target also in how do you create these kind of tailored mechanisms, financial mechanisms for this different mosaic of territorial instruments. So that's a challenge, but also an opportunity to work with communities and other actors. Well, also, our federal financial gap in 2018 was around USD 1 billion. This relates more to the federal government instruments, so this is protected areas, sustainable forest management, that kind of stuff. But this doesn't account to all this additional and complementary gap, which is subnational conservation gaps. So the states do have protected areas, do have territorial frameworks for protecting biodiversity, that they have also a financial gap. The 30 by 30 goal, agricultural transition. So, I mean, Peter showed us that agriculture and regenerative livestock is a possibility. And you know what? Getting there is the difficult part. So who is financing this transition invoice to get us from the traditional food systems to a more sustainable pathway? That's something that is not included in this gap. And also, we have a huge, huge gap on marine conservation, not only in terms of protected areas and mechanisms, but also into finance. So that's something we need to look upon. Then, well, what are the barriers hindering this full mobilization? So we want to look into environmental fiscal reforms. Currently, there are over-regulated, but also non-sufficiently regulated sectors that are giving contradictory price signals. So we need to start reforming that. For example, a carbon credit is subject to taxation, and the first links of agricultural and livestock production are not. So we need to start looking at how to incentivize people to go through this transition, also by giving them some fiscal easements. Also, contradictory territorial finance schemes and price signals. As I mentioned, subsidies. You can find in a protected area or in a particular territory a subsidy, a positive subsidy that gives you, let's say, $100 to conserve, and in the same territory, there's a subsidy by the Secretary of Agriculture that gives $500 to do a complete opposite thing, right? So we need to start also working at the territory to address these issues. Lack of law enforcement on territorial ordinance or organization, and it's still quite easy to compensate for land use changes. So compensation is not a deterrent for land use and biodiversity degradation, right? Also, financial and private sector disclosures are still voluntary. We need to strengthen regulation related to how and where the financial sector invests in Mexico. Unclear regulation for carbon and biodiversity credits. This is something also I think Peter mentioned on the panel yesterday. Voluntary carbon market in Mexico just expanded like fungus. I won't say if it's a positive or negative fungus, but now that the fungus is among us, we need to try to work with them. I need to try to reform voluntary carbon markets to get them to adopt environmental safeguards, prior informed consent, and of course, social safeguards. So it's a positive mechanism if well addressed, right? And something also, I wanted to tell you about this. Peter also mentioned the Climate Action Reserve yesterday. So one of the factors for the voluntary mechanisms to grow in Mexico was that the CAR made a specific Mexican protocol that addresses and understands the characteristic of forestry lands in Mexico. So 80% of voluntary carbon markets in Mexico are registered under CAR, and I think it's because of this, because they understand that working in Mexico depends on other factors and mainly on these issues and these characteristics about land tenure, right? So that was also something I want to tell you. Lack of public canalization mechanisms, just like trust funds, public funds are not well developed right now. We had one national that was eliminated a couple of years ago after 6 years of strengthening and investing in it. The government just disappeared it. And also, conservation projects are still heavily reliant on donations. We haven't got to that point where conservation projects become sustainable model business, or at least sustainable projects by themselves. They're still quite reliable on donations. And also, some mechanisms are not tailored to integrate IPLC safeguards. So that's also super important. Okay. Then, some of the mechanisms also that, well, the way forward, some opportunities we have found in Mexico is that state-level public finance is, coming into the scene. The growth of innovation in mechanisms in the states for the past 6-7 years have been quite interesting. So the states right now are taking a lot of this responsibility on finance biodiversity, and they're creating some really interesting mechanisms. such as, well, earmarking carbon taxes for forest compensations. Right now, Querétaro, Guanajuato, they have a carbon tax. Zacatecas is coming, Tamaulipas is coming, Nuevo León is coming, Colima, Aguascalientes, Yucatan, etc. So also we are looking at an increment on carbon taxes, and they all have an impact also into forest compensations and biodiversity conservation. Compensation reform, habitat banking, this is something also we're looking into. I know the US has the wetland banking, Colombia has habitat banking, and we're building upon those lessons. And this is also related to biodiversity credits. Risk mechanisms, some of you might know the parametric reef insurance here in Cancun, in Quintana Roo. Some other parametric insurance are starting to be developed related to coffee plantations, cocoa plantations, and the relation to climate change. Thematic bonds. Oh, I'm over the time, sorry, super over the time, right? It was too much information. Sorry, I'm gonna be quicker. So thematic bonds, we are looking also into thematic bonds. Estado de Mexico just released one. Jalisco is going to release a 1 billion thematic bond. International cooperation, hybrid finance. USAID is investing heavily on hybrid finance here in the Yucatan Peninsula, Oaxaca, and Chiapas, and payment for environmental service and public-private restoration efforts. I know some TNC people is here. I know if also WWF, but also we are looking at the first project for finance permanence here in Yucatan, supported by TNC and WWF and BIOFIN. Okay, the last one, at least in terms of information. So we also have a quite growth in the private sector and the financial sector involvement. So we're also looking into, well, voluntary carbon, biodiversity and restoration credits, certifications, bioeconomy. So Mexico will have bioeconomy strategy, we hope, by next year. So this kind of gives the guidelines on what bioeconomy is, how can the private sector be involved. So it's basically anything to circular economy, biochemicals, biofuels, etc. And the financial sector, this is something that has been also growing a lot in the last couple of years. So Mexico already has a sustainable finance taxonomy that was presented this year. We are still working on a biodiversity taxonomy for the financial sector. And we also need to work a lot on investment concepts for MDBs, NDBs, and private banks. Well, multilateral development banks, national development banks, and private banks. And I don't think we are yet in the time where we can say to these banks, what are we talking about when we say nature positive investments? So I think Sean's presentation last day was super interesting. I mean, we are seeing the same problems in terms of project pipeline, funding readiness, but we don't have the billion of dollars available. That's something we don't have. So we need to start giving the banks this information in order for them to understand what are positive investments for biodiversity, right? And then also that is working a lot right now in Mexico is impact and dependencies for the financial sector. So I don't know how many of you have heard of TNFD. One, two, okay. Well, so TNFD is a task force for nature-related financial disclosures. So it's a framework, international framework for financial institutions and private institutions to identify, assess, and disclose their impacts and dependencies on biodiversity. So this is quite related to the sustainable finance taxonomy. And right now, the Central Bank of Mexico, a couple of private banks, and our equivalent to the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, are part of the TNFD, also part of TCFD, which is the same but for climate. And we think that this advancement in implementing TNFD and TCFD frameworks could give a lot of information to the financial sector on how, where, and how much investment can be done into biodiversity. Well, just to finish on this one, we are working a lot of metrics and indicators. I might sound like a finance bro, but so IFRS, SASB, GRI, ESRS, the science-based target networks, Partnership for Biodiversity, Account and Finance, and the World Benchmark Alliance, we're looking into that to create the metrics and indicators needed for the financial sector to understand biodiversity. So that is something that we are working at with the Ministry of Finance, with the Central Bank of Mexico, to try to build the information databases to understand the relation between the finance sector and the biodiversity conservation sectors. And last one, okay, some takeaway messages. I'm not going to tell them all. It's something that we already said. So, well, we are quite committed to creating the necessary enabling conditions to implement the Kunming-Montreal Convention. The federal level right now is leading the way into financial regulation and disclosures related to biodiversity. We have been seeing this, these changes, systemic changes in the financial sector, but we still need to work a lot on these three issues. And finally, I would say that we need to still find adequate financial mechanisms that integrate IPLC considerations, and of course, the huge gap in marine conservation finance. That is something we need to accelerate the pace. So that's it. Thank you so much, and sorry for so much information.
Stay there. Muchísimas gracias, but stay there for a minute. So we're going to give you a lightning round question. One question. Oh boy. Out of everything that you've put up and all of the information, I'm going to force you to try to pick. Because you said double the resource mobilization just for conservation in Mexico, which is over 1 billion USD. That's a lot. So out of everything you've shared, what do you think is the greatest challenge for making biodiversity financing happen in Mexico? One question.
Okay, I think we need to focus on systemic changes related to agriculture and the financial sector. Once we kind of figure out and once we can provide them, these two sectors, with clear understanding of what biodiversity and nature positive impact investments are, I think that could be like a milestone in biodiversity conservation. Because right now, and that's the objective of BIOFIN, there's not the common language between these two sectors to understand each other. So as long as we give them the proper information and don't kind of scare them into biodiversity conservation, I think that might open the tap for mobilizing resources from different sources.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Alonso for being on stage.
So I know I said one, but then I said two. I buried the lead. I completely buried the lead. We're going to close the morning with one more presentation, but first hearing from Representative Joe Neguse, who has served as the congressman for Colorado's 2nd District in the U.S. House since being first elected in November 2018. He currently serves as the chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and is the number 5 elected position in House leadership, believe it or not, and is the first Coloradan to serve in senior leadership in over 85 years. He's going to share some pre-recorded remarks highlighting his vision for a national biodiversity strategy. He will be followed by a conversation between Sasha Spector and Leslie Haroun, and we'll get to them as soon as we hear. Leslie, would you like to come sit down? Sasha, would you like to come forward as well? Perfect. And then we'll hear from Congressman Neguse, and then we'll move on to a conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Joe Neguse, and I am honored to represent the state of Colorado in the United States Congress. I'm delighted to be able to join you all virtually, and I'd like to thank Colorado State University and the Salazar Center for inviting me to attend the 11th Annual International Symposium on Conservation Impact. I'd also like to thank all of you for taking the time to attend this week's important conference. As I'm sure that all of you are aware, right now the United States and much of the global community continues to face an unprecedented decline in biodiversity. And this is in no small part due, of course, to human activity, meaning it's up to us to act in the best interest of our planet's health, and it's up to us to address the escalating biodiversity crisis. Recent scientific studies continue to confirm that human-driven activity ultimately has a profound impact on vital Earth ecosystems, natural processes, of course the increases of pollution of land, air, and water, and the decline of biodiversity disproportionately impacts indigenous communities that rely on nature for essential services. Now, what some of you may not be aware of is that in Congress, I and many others are calling for a whole-of-government approach to tackle the present threat of declining biodiversity, happening not just in our country, but across the globe. I've joined my colleagues in introducing a national biodiversity strategy. The strategy process would encourage U.S. agencies to identify and pursue a full range of actions within existing laws and policies and regulations and encourage consideration of new ones. It would also promote accountability and progress in addressing the biodiversity crisis through a new quadrennial assessment. Put more simply, a national biodiversity strategy would work to address the damage of ecosystems, increased pollution, and the acceleration of climate change, and the way in which that has had an impact on the natural world. Over the past 2 years, Congressional Democrats and President Biden, as many of you know, made historic progress in the fight against the climate crisis. I was proud to work with my colleagues to craft the Inflation Reduction Act, a monumental investment in clean energy production, scientific research, wildfire response, and wildlife recovery. It's time for us, in my view, to build on that momentum, to meet the moment, to take the actions necessary to finally address the pervasive decline of biodiversity. And that's exactly what the adoption of a national strategy would do. So, as you take the time over the next 2 days to discuss and map out informed, adaptive, proactive, and nature-based solutions to promoting conservation across our country, please know that you have a partner in me and in my office. Together, I truly believe we will create a resilient and healthy future for our planet and for our children. And so with that being said, thank you again for participating in this conference, and I look forward to hearing all that's sure to come out of these very productive conversations. As always, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay hopeful.